And welcome, Chi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. I always have this feeling of, just when you planned a birthday party and it comes to the time, you think no one's going to turn up. So I'm glad to see, I'm glad to see some faces. So thank you. It really means a lot that you want to engage in this conversation about my book, but about race and the church, really. So I'm just going to spend some time just talking about the book, but also a particular kind of sharing a little presentation on Black bodies in white spaces. And the book coming out in May 2021, really, it feels like it has come at the right time. But actually the book had been quite a few years in the making, kind of in my head. A few years ago, in 2013, I wrote my first book called Am I Beautiful, which was about body image and Christian women. And actually, in the process of writing that book, I realised that quite a lot of my sense of identity was not just about being Christian or a woman, but was about being a Black Christian woman. So I really wanted to write something particularly about that experience. So I had been in conversation with my editor, Catherine Benn at Hodder, for probably about three years, and where we wanted to shape and write something. So I put together this proposal, it was accepted, got the contract last kind of February. And then 2020 happened, the pandemic. And actually, I am so grateful, really, that I was writing the book through that period in history. I'm glad that I hadn't finished it just before, because it turned into something completely different, because the world turned into something completely different. So I guess just some insight into what it was like writing the book at that time. So we were all in this global pandemic, lockdown. I have a full-time job working at Christian Aid as head of public engagement. I'm on the leadership team of my church, do a lot of BBC broadcasting. I have a he was then a 2-year-old, nurseries were closed, also randomly started a business. So it was absolute chaos, as I'm sure it was for many of you. It was absolute chaos in that space and that time. And then the kind of pressure of having to write this book almost added to the sense of I guess, reckoning that I was feeling in wider society at the time. So yeah, in amongst dealing with potty training and keeping him entertained, Zoom meetings, running a team at work, I was writing this. But the pandemic happened, and George Floyd's murder in May last year became really the pivotal moment in the book. And everything seems to have kind of centered around that. So I sometimes wonder, how many times do I mention George Floyd in the book? Quite a lot. Because George Floyd's murder really made me think a lot, as lots of us were, about Black bodies in white spaces, in wider society, but also in particular in the church. So by the time I watched George Floyd's murder on my phone, I had already become well acquainted with Black death. I had come to expect the brutalization of Black bodies from a very young age, through observing and watching how Black people cautiously navigated our way through different contexts, and witnessing how we were received, the clutched handbag, the subtle crossing of the street, how we were represented in art, in film, in entertainment. Blackness had long been associated with sorrow and suffering and death in my mind, long before I came to really understand what those things meant. I grew up with on-screen portrayals of the violence committed against Black people during the transatlantic slave trade and beyond, by watching things including Roots, or 12 Years a Slave, or Django Unchained, or The Birth of a Nation, or Glory. These have throughout the years reinforced this idea that Black people should expect violence and danger. Now, to some, whether that's consciously or subconsciously, a Black person's body is seen as no different from a piece of property with which the owner can do whatever they wish. As James Cone, the Black liberation theologian, writes cites in The Cross and the Lynching Tree, the people of the South don't think any more of killing the black fellows than you would think of killing a flea. Now, we live in the shadow of the days in which black people were the property and white people were the owners, when black bodies were rendered worthless, including black bodies like George Floyd's. And the reactions that I have to these stories, both the ones from long ago and the ones more recently, are often visceral and physical. I recall standing in my kitchen shaking after doing some research for the book and being hit with what felt like relentless accounts of the violence against black people that had been justified throughout the centuries. And I shook as I was reminded of the inhumane conditions that enslaved people, kidnapped from their homes in African nations, were kept in. I could almost smell the blood, the salty tears, and the sweat in the belly of those slave ships, and hear the cries of those people who had gone from complete freedom to this nightmarish existence. Some of them didn't even survive the Middle Passage, while some longed for death rather than the present reality in which they found themselves and the future reality that would become their tragic story. We have to remember that they were trapped like animals for months on end. And I wonder what it must have felt like for them to be denied even the dignity of being able to take their own lives. And I shook as I recalled the story of Reni Taylor. Reni Taylor was on her way back to her husband and her young child after attending church on the 3rd of September 1944 with her friend Fanny Danielle, when a car drove up and stopped next to them on the road. And inside the car were 7 men, including US Army Private Herbert Lovett, who, after falsely accusing Taylor of cutting a white boy in the town earlier in the evening, forced her into the car at gunpoint. They then drove her to a patch of trees nearby, forcibly undressed her and raped her. And I shook as I recalled how I had learned that physician J. Marion Sims, who's the celebrated father of modern gynecology, practiced his surgery without anesthesia on enslaved women, Lucy, Anarcha, Betsy, and others whose names we do not know. The past 400 years of Black history is a story of brutalization and violence. And it's hard for people like me, living centuries after some of these atrocities and an ocean away from what we perceive to be the worst of it, to separate ourselves from the cruelty experienced by those who have gone before us. When I read or hear stories of the rape of Black women, the experimentation on enslaved Black people's bodies, the medical advancement, the whipping, the lynching, the killings, it's as if I'm experiencing the violence myself. Monica Williams, a professor and psychologist, describes this as vicarious trauma. And she argues that race-based stress can be triggered through viewing racial discrimination and brutality and violence or aggression through a third party, such as social media or watching the news, and suggests that racism should be included as one of the causes of PTSD. Now, vicarious trauma is both present and historic. When I see another Black person killed, I experience it vicariously. And it also reminds me of the centuries of similar instances of violence against Black bodies, those with whose lives I feel a strong bond that stretches out from the past through to the present day. Since Martin Luther King's assassination, the brutal murders of Black men and women in majority white contexts have not disappeared. In recent years, we've seen many new hashtags, many new names of people killed. As Will Smith said in 2016, racism isn't getting worse, it's just getting filmed. We have seen far too many social media tags containing the names of Black people who found themselves the latest in a long line of victims facing violence, brutalization, and death as a result of a pervasive white supremacist culture. And this culture renders Black bodies at risk. So here we are, 13 months-ish on from George Floyd's murder, does the call for justice feel as urgent as it did 12 months ago? In the weeks preceding George Floyd's murder, we in the UK learned very quickly that the arrival of COVID-19 seemed to lift old bandages, allowing us to see the rotting flesh of inequality that lay underneath. We knew very soon that while this global pandemic was killing hundreds of thousands of people around the world, Black people were again being disproportionately affected. And what we learned from the pandemic was that some people's lives mattered more than others. And perhaps, despite centuries of apparent progress, Black lives and Black bodies did not matter after all. In the discussions with fellow Black Britons following George Floyd's death, those conversations that I've had over the past few months, I noticed a common and familiar thread. When we watched George Floyd's murder, we saw our own necks on the line, that sense of vicarious trauma which can cross the Atlantic, just as it can stretch throughout the decades. There's a question that often that I hear, which is why it is that Black people, Black British people, take it so personally when Black people in the US are killed. And I believe it's because we see ourselves in our American brothers and sisters, precisely because we see ourselves in other Black people everywhere. And there are these close bonds that can be formed between oppressed groups in a way that can't be understood outside these groups. We see ourselves in George Floyd, just as we saw ourselves in Breonna Taylor and Stephen Lawrence and Rodney King and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and lynched Black men and women. James Cone again discusses a painting of a lynched man left at the doors of a church, painted by Hale Woodruff. It's called By Parties Unknown. Now, if you look closely where the rope around the lynched man's neck meets the ground, you can see that flowers are growing, because there is beauty to be found in the midst of pain. And Cone writes, the beauty in Black existence is as real as the brutality, and the beauty prevents the brutality from having the final word. Black suffering needs radical and creative voices, prophetic advocates who can tell brutal and beautiful stories of how oppressed Black people survived with a measure of dignity when they were not meant to. Who are we? Why are we here? And what must we do to achieve our full humanity in a world that denies it? The history of Black bodies at the hands of white supremacy has been marked by violence, brutalization, and untimely death. It's a story that is retold and repeated in each generation. The tragic accounts of the deaths of those who did not survive the Middle Passage, to those unarmed human beings, loved by God, who were beaten, shot, or suffocated to death at the hands of those who were supposed to protect them, to those who were killed by white supremacists. The story of Black death is a devastating one, but at times in history it has been these tragic stories that have woken people up and spurred them towards seeking justice and demanding better. Black death can demonstrate one of the fundamental truths, I believe, for the Christian faith, which is that the future is brighter. Where the world has been a place of injustice for Black people, there will be justice in the world to come. Where Black people have not been treated as fully human, their humanity will be fully realised and valued in the world to come. Where Black people have been subjugated to violence and exploitation and murder, the world to come will be a place of peace everlasting. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel puts forward this radical idea of God's kingdom as being countercultural, turning things as we know them on their heads. It's in this upside down place that the last will be first, and those who mourn, the oppressed, the vilified, the subjugated, will be the blessed ones. And this is the place in which white supremacy and its lies about who is worthy of dignity and value will die. And this is the place where Black dignity finds its fulfillment in front of a loving God who welcomes us home. So My book, God is Not a White Man and Other Revelations, is kind of centered around how Black bodies and Blackness is seen as less than, and particularly Black female bodies as the opposite of how we have, or how society has presented God as both white and male throughout centuries, throughout art. So you'll find that in the first chapter, I focus on that question of literal depictions of God and what it means to be made in God's image or not, or to feel as if you're not. But really, what the rest of the book is about demonstrating how that pervasive white supremacy and patriarchy finds its way into lots of different scenarios, whether it's depictions of Africa, whether it's in interracial marriage or relationships or sexuality, or what feminism, white feminism and womanism, and also the church, most devastatingly, which is what I focus on in the last chapter. So really the book is about that. It's about my experience as a Black woman and what I experience, how I experience God, what I see, I guess, the effect of white supremacy and patriarchy and depictions of God on me as a Black woman. I just want to end this section with just a reading from the preface, which is really what I'm trying to demonstrate in the whole of the book, which is that whiteness and patriarchy, or whiteness and maleness, are not the default human or the only ways in which God can be depicted, or in the best ways or the best forms through which God can be experienced. So I had wanted to be a journalist from when I was from when I was about 13 years old, but I went to Cambridge to study theology. And one of my lecturers said to me after writing an essay that I wrote like a journalist. And I took that as a compliment, but that's not what he meant, because he had seen through my attempt to present a simple reading of theology as a series of intellectual arguments listed one after the other. This theologian thought this, and that theologian thought that. Like the journalist I wanted to be, I had attempted to take myself out of the story, achieving in my essays the goal of being that objective writer, a faceless observer. I had presented few of my own thoughts, feeling them to be unimportant and potentially distracting in writing academic essays about the nature of God. I have spent much of my life continuing to do this, making myself smaller, accommodating the expectations of how others want the world to be. While patriarchal influences draw a box in which women must sit and conform, white supremacy quietens the unique voice of a Black experience. There is not room for both. Perhaps I should have listened much earlier to the lesson that my Cambridge supervisor taught me, that my voice matters, not merely in the social justice or political sense, but because when it comes to theology, the personal account is just as important as the historic, academic, or intellectual. In the same way, my life experiences also matter. We are part of the stories. We are part of the story. This is arguably more true of theological explorations than it is of any others. Since God cannot be seen or touched in a physical sense, we can only experience God spiritually in our inner beings. And our experience of God can then only be relayed through our words, our speech. Translation exercise taking place in which communicating our experience of God cannot escape being shaped by our histories, our social contexts, our genders, our racial backgrounds, our individual stories. It is these personal stories that shape our knowledge of the divine. How can God be revealed except through the variety of different personal stories, physical realities, and cultural contexts in which humans experience God's presence? As 17th century philosopher John Locke wrote, God, when he makes the prophet, does not unmake the man. I am very aware, therefore, of who I am. I write this book from the perspective of a Black British woman of African descent who straddles the line between first generation and second generation immigrants. I'm also a millennial, a Black British woman of African descent who came of age around the turn of the century. I'm heterosexual and I'm able-bodied. I am married and I am a mother. I guess I could be described as middle class. All these intersecting identities shape how I view the world, how I experience it, and how I relate to God. My understanding of who God is should be given just as much prominence as that of a white man in his 60s. But for all sorts of reasons, some of which will be explored in this book, it is not. My aim here is not to convince you of the fact that God is not a white man, or persuade you of the literal and intellectual arguments of the nature of God's race. Instead, it is to tell stories of the real life and far-reaching effects of a world that has presented God as white and male. There should be no sense of a normative framework when it comes to divine revelation.
Thank you, Chine. I was thinking that we might kind of do some breakout discussions, but actually, as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking it would be really good if we could just share in this space, and I will stop recording in a moment. You know, as you've just so beautifully said, we all come from different perspectives and we all bring ourselves to this conversation and this discussion. And there's across this room probably a diverse range of reasons why we're here, why we're drawn to read this book, whether it's part of a longer anti-racism journey or it's something that finally resonates with more elements of who you are, or and so I think we'll just open up this time for just a few minutes for people to share, you know, what was it that drew you to this conversation today? And if you've read the book or if you were struck by something that's already been said today, was there something that jumps out at you, that struck you, or an observation that you've made as a result of this? And you can feel free to write that in the chat or to speak it out loud, and we'll see how we go. But I'm going to just pause the recording now because I don't want people to feel, you know, uneasy about sharing.
Thank you. There's so much to respond to. I'll answer the question that I remember first. David's question about as a Black man, what do I want you to get out of it? I think what I have been encouraged by hearing from Black men who have read it is that in many ways it feels like their experience too and what they have wanted to say. But I think what it has provided them with is also insight into the different space that Black women are in within society, but also within the church, and where our kind of experiences of God in the church or everywhere else differ, and how there is, you know, there's almost, yes, as a Black man, you are in many ways oppressed, but at least there's something of the maleness that you can kind of hold on to, especially when it comes to reflections of God as male. So there is this sense of like, okay, you might have some understanding of a he. God is he, if you call God he. As kind of giving you a sense of power that Black women don't have. But I have been really amazed by the response from Black women in particular. There's one archdeacon, his Black woman, who said that, you know, people have been asking her to write a book for a long time, but then she's read mine and she thought, oh well, Chini's told all of our stories, because there's so much that resonates for, you know, so much of what's in my book is the story of all black Christian women have points where they have experienced othering or sexism or whatever it is. So I'd hope that the book would give you some insight into that, David. And the kind of cop-out answer is actually I do want everyone to read it, and I think my dad often talks about it as the book is like that story of a blind man feeling his way around an elephant, where it's like all different people have different experiences, because some people get from it, you know, just reading it just as a social commentary on basically Black Lives Matter. Some people are reading it as a theological exploration of the nature of God. Some people are reading it as a womanist text. And I think there is something for everyone in it. Phil, on the question of whether that point about white people not being paralyzed by guilt, I think, is really important. And I think I talk somewhere in the book around we want to move beyond the kind of self-flagellation, because I don't think that moves any of us forward. It's kind of, it's not going to get us anywhere. But at least, like, the positive thing is, at least there is a recognition. And for most of you here, I'm sure for all of you here, you're not questioning whether racism exists in society, but some people do. And some people in the church do, and some people aren't even at that place of recognition. So, you know, at least you are feeling something, which I think is positive. Even since writing the book, my thoughts on this issue have probably moved on a little bit. And one of the things that has moved my thoughts on is in reading Emma Dabbery's book called What White People Can Do Next, which talks about how actually that kind of the story of white guilt is and white people giving up space or power or feeling bad about racism is not really a compelling argument, which is probably why we are still in this situation. Like, that's not enough. What is needed is for us to tell a different story, which is around human flourishing, which is about the solidarity of each of us, and how, you know, it's better for white people if Black people can't be killed in the street by police officers. Like, it's better for all of us if all of us are able to move through society safely. It's not just about this sense of defensiveness or guilt and us kind of giving up space, because I think that will also always lead to resentment in other spaces, and that's why I'm experiencing a lot on kind of social media, where people in certain areas, spaces, responding just to the title of the book, which they see as something that erodes their own sense of power. So how can we kind of flip that story, I think, is an important one, recognizing that there are tangible things that also need to be done in leadership teams, or, you know, quotas, or all those kinds of things as well. Yeah, and what were the other reflections? So Siobhan, on South Africa, I don't know if you've got to the bit in the book where I talk about my one and only trip to South Africa, and how I found that such a strange experience. I went for a wedding with a group of white friends, mainly white men, and that sense of arriving in Africa and kind of stepping out of the plane and thinking, whoa, this is a little bit different to what I've experienced with African countries. And why is that? Because there are lots of white people here. And that sense of being like stared at restaurants as a Black person who was white people, that the fact that most of the people serving the restaurants were Black people, most of the people eating the restaurants were white people. I just found it such a strange place. And yeah, I think I use South Africa as a kind of example of that, the place of Black bodies within predominantly white spaces and the kind of problems around that. But also in that kind of Africa chapter, I talk about one thing that didn't come across probably in my opening sections, or particularly in the chapter about Black death and brutalization, is a story of Black dignity that I think I have lost most of my I have not had most of my life, which is, you know, alongside the oppression and violence, there are these amazing stories of how Black people are intelligent, creative, wonderful, have such rich stories, have vibrant cultures of our own. And there were all sorts of stories that I uncovered in even the course of writing the book, about my own sense of dignity and my own sense of Black people as absolutely being made in the image of God, and God knowing that, and that kind of uncovering those stories. Yes.
There's one or two more comments in the questions, and I think Just to remind people, the recording is running, so let me know if you'd like me to pause it at any point. But there's a question about the validation of the afterlife as a contrast to present suffering as being a challenging point in the book, and I wonder if you'd like to comment on that. I don't know if you can see the question.
Yes, cool. So in the, I don't know if you've read the book, Judith, yet, but yeah, so what I read this morning was kind of talking about that kind of contrast. But in reading an early draft of the book, Robert Beckford kind of challenged me on that same point, which was that this idea of, you know, it's almost like this celebrated sense of, you know, life is terrible for Black people in life, but it'll all be all right afterwards. Now, for me as a Christian, I have to hold on to this idea of the kingdom of God as something better coming, and that's just for all of us, not just Black people. But yeah, I do understand how the kind of the victor narrative, the suffering Christ as kind of the means through which, I guess the beautiful story of God is told, it can be problematic. And in that kind of Black Death chapter, I talk about how, you know, various instances of Black suffering and death that then lead to something else. So for example, Emmett Till's murder when he was 14 in 1960 something. His mother used that, his death, his brutal murder, for looking at a white woman, to basically tell the story of what's happening to Black people's bodies. So she held an open casket, there's lots of media around it. And so there was that story that was told. So there was that positive thing that came out of that horrible thing. George Floyd is another example where, you know, it's highly problematic to talk about him as a martyr or someone who laid down his life for the cause of racial justice. He did not. He was brutally murdered by a white police officer. He didn't choose to. Nevertheless, you know, in the months following his death, at least, there was what felt like a reckoning with racial justice, the likes of which I hadn't seen in all my life. The problem is a year later, what difference that made, I don't know yet. But I understand how problematic it can be. But as a person of hope who tries to live in hope, I think that that when there are positive things that might follow, not to celebrate the negative thing that happened or the horrific thing that happened, but to recognize what might have come afterwards. But yeah, it's really tricky.
Did Faith or Judith want to comment back on that before we move on to Martin?
I just thought your response about Christian hope, or your hope, I don't want to define that for you, but that's really resonant for me, because I know, like, as a privileged white person myself, I can kind of, I don't know, collapse into, I need to do all these things right now. But if I don't have like something to point toward, like in the Christian sense, the telos, you know, what we're moving toward, I just collapse. So I thought, thank you for mentioning that about hope.
It's kind of that thing of like hope and justice, isn't it? Like it's not, we don't just wait for the end for things to be made better, but and we try to work towards God's kingdom coming here now, recognizing where it has not, but it is, yeah, holding those two things in tension is not easy.
I think that summarizes it for me, is the justice, that we're not slowed down for seeking justice now by the idea of there being a place where there is justice. Like, that should inspire us to move forward for now. Martin, did you have something you wanted to share?
Yes, thank you. Such a powerful message. Thank you so much, Chine. I just want to pick up on that message of hope, because I'm feeling, just between us on the call, I'm feeling quite emotional about with my personal lack of hope. In 1979, as a student at Goldsmiths College in
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, there are times in the book when there are times now where I'm also not hopeful, and people often ask me, you know, where are the signs of hope, and I do find it very difficult to answer because I feel like it's not obvious. But the thing I go back to is Black Lives Matter protests last year, and thinking about the numbers of, like, speaking particularly in the church leaders, particularly white male church leaders who were suddenly like, okay, we need to do something. People who hadn't been speaking about that, you know, in the years before. So I guess that is positive. But again, we're a bit further on down the road now, so who knows where that will lead. I guess the reason when I said I'd been talking about the book for a few years, 3 or 4 years, it was, for me, 2016 was obviously for many of us the year of hopelessness. Could not believe that we were in that situation. And I write in the book how, you know, Trump's election, and I was working for the Evangelical Alliance then, was to me like waking up and like not recognizing my own family and thinking, oh no, we're not where I thought we were all we all are supposed to be. And that legitimization of racism and misogyny, absolutely devastating. And I guess I'm experiencing it much more on social media these days. I'm not getting like horrific abuse or anything, but the people that will never read my book, who are the people who hold certain views, like to respond to me about my book and talk about how, you know, you've gone too far, you're taking the racism agenda too far, you know, all this kind of stuff. And that is where I kind of despair, but I'm also like, it's good to hear that, because it's good to be reminded that we're not all in Red Letter Christians Book Club. There is a world out there where lots of people would roll their eyes at, you know, everything that's in my book. So I think we need that, to be reminded of that, and the challenge that still exists, because I can understand how you in the late 70s and 80s were thinking, oh, everything's going to be all right, but it's good to be reminded that it's not, and because there's still so far to go. I also have hope, the usual hope, which is in young people, because I think I'm pretty woke until I am in a room with people who are 10 years younger than me, who are just like, I hope that they are not going to let the world continue as it is, and the world will be different when they're running the show. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Chine, did you have another section of the, you know, or another theme that you wanted to introduce at this point, or what do you think?
Sure, I can.
We'll keep coming back to doing questions sporadically, but have a little.
Yeah. So I'm going to read a section from the chapter called "The Sisterhood is Black and White," which also touches on Beyonce's Lemonade album quite a lot. But I'm going to read from a section called "The Mule of the World." For centuries, we have not been seen. In times past, the white men arrived in the land of our ancestors and did not see us as human, as worthy of our own homes, cultures, or dignity. Under the gaze of the white colonizers, for whom power and dominion were the most important things, the denigration of Africans in every way was a logical consequence. The colonizers could not in any way concede power to these so-called new people groups. So at every turn, they chose to show how Africans were lesser in intellect, in beauty, in form, and in spirituality. It is this perceived proximity to animals that made it easier to exploit black bodies, to enslave them, to make white nations rich from the physical toil black bodies faced. For black women, the mule of the world, as the hero of Zora Neale Hurston's 1937 book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, describes them, there was an extra layer of denigration on top of the physical and emotional labour and exploitation. This idea that they could never be as lovely, pure, or revered as white women. Quote, black women were hypersexual but not beautiful, and that is an important distinction, journalist Afua Hirsch writes in her important book, British. Beauty was in some respects the first racism. European chroniclers of Africa were keen to cast the African body as the darkness that contrasted to the light of whiteness, the supposed ugliness of its women as proof of the beauty and superiority of the white female form. Black women's bodies have always been compared to white women's bodies and found wanting. Take the comparison between white female tennis players such as Maria Sharapova and Serena Williams. One journalist writing in Rolling Stone magazine in 2013 said, Sharapova is tall, white and blonde, and because of that, makes more money in endorsements than Serena, who is black, beautiful and built like one of those monster trucks that crushes Volkswagens at sports arenas. Perhaps he thought that adding the word beautiful would detract from the outright racism and misogyny. It is not just the comparison of our bodies that has divided the sisterhood along black and white lines, but a white supremacy that creates the need for the patriarchal protection by white men of white women, to whose purity and dignity the biggest threat is the black man. In learning about these age-old stories of sex and power and race, the key players are white men, and white women. Black women do not even feature. This is reflected in so many ways in white majority spaces, including churches, where the stereotypes about black women persist. Like Eddo-Lodge in Rev, which I talked about earlier, the part we play in the drama has been defined long before the script has been written. So I guess that kind of, that's something that I would want David to read in the book, which is around, I guess how black women are ignored in many spaces. And similar to what Faith was talking about in her academic work, which is around the purity of white women's bodies, which is something that needs to be preserved, even if that means black men and black women have to face kind of brutalization and death and murder.
Kathy, you had a question or two. Did you want to ask?
Yeah,
now?
thank you.
Are you happy to do it on video, or do you want me to pause it?
No, I'm okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chine. I really loved the book. I finished reading it half an hour before we started this morning. I really enjoyed it. I've got two questions, and they're both around sort of two opposite sides of combating racism in the church. My experience is that I have the dubious honour of being thrown off a ministry course in the Church of England for calling out racist content. And the content that was presented was of Livingstone and a lot of history given about Livingstone, 3 missionary society logos and a tiny picture of maybe 35 or so African peoples in Western colonial garb, and a section of a presentation on the church in Africa with no mention of slavery, colonialism, or anything that followed since. So I put my hand up and said, I'm sorry, that was a very whitewashed version of events. I don't recognise that as history. And because I did that, I was told that I couldn't continue the course. And I was slandered, lied about. And the vicar that sent me from my own church also wrote a blog about it, outing me as a gay woman. So I was really kind of, it was pretty horrific. But what really concerned me about this was a Foundations for Ministry course, where there were about 35, 40 people in a major city who were interested in training for lay ministry, and that was being presented to them by church leaders as the church's history. So my first question is around how can we challenge the deep racism in the Church of England, because there is a thread of it that is just so evil that it needs digging out, and all of us need to work together to be able to do that. And my second question is around, so in the church that the Anglican church that I was attending, what happened after George Floyd's death was quite interesting. A few of us wrote to the vicar to say, I'm quite concerned that our inclusive church has not spoken about George Floyd's death when 2 Sundays had passed without it being mentioned. And because we're part of the LGBT community, we were uncomfortable with one side of inclusion being covered, but not the racism side, because as far as I'm concerned, we need to kind of lend solidarity to each other. And so what happened was 2 people of colour were interviewed, but there was no sort of understanding that the white majority church needed to look at itself. And I know that people sort of can get a bit fed up of white people hand-wringing about, oh, terrible guilt, but actually we do need to dig out what we've learned as history and from our families that's not right, in order to kind of move forwards, I think, together. And so after that, what happened was a lot of pictures of Black Jesus appeared, because there's obviously beautiful icons from all over the place. And it made me realise that the same thing is going on as happened with the rainbow flags. There's been no real change, but there is this very cosmetic change where if you go into the church, you'll see the kind of icons of Black Jesus. It's on the website. You'll see the rainbow flags, but there's no actual shift or understanding, or many people of colour in that church, which is very white majority, and as in my case, not very much listening to LGBTQ people. So I'm sort of drawing the parallel there. And I was really interested in the end of your book when you're talking about this in the diversity bit around, it's not enough just to have photos of Black Jesus, people of colour in the church, LGBT people in the church, if we don't have a real voice and a real inclusion and a genuine presence. So I have 2 questions, and one is, how do we dig out this awful, evil racism that still exists and that the Church of England is very keen to deny? And how do we kind of move past this very cosmetic surgery, basically, around making something look inclusive, where actually the work hasn't genuinely been done? And it's really difficult because obviously lots of places are genuinely doing the work. So how we kind of sort through it and how we work together to get really meaningful change. Sorry, that was quite long.
Thanks, Kathy. Jenny, you happy to take that? I'm aware too, like trying to work out some of these questions are for us as white communities to answer, as well as, yeah. So anyway, I'm just hand back over to you, Jenny.
Yeah, I'll just share some thoughts, but I'm keen to hear what others might think as well. That is absolutely right what you say. So on the first question about what I think needs to happen is we need to question everything. And I think once you see things, I think you can't then unsee them. And then for me, and like even just writing the book and recognizing my own education or my lack of knowledge on issues of colonialism, of racism, the things that have been presented to me, because obviously I grew up in the UK, I grew up in British churches, and I know that things are different, hopefully different now, but I learned much more about, Henry VIII or the Egyptians, who are obviously white because they're so advanced, than Britain's role in colonialism, which has led to the inequality that we see today around the world, and how those things are linked, not separate. When I did my book launch at Southwark Cathedral, the Dean gave us a tour around the cathedral just before it started. And sorry, I'm not actually an Anglican, so the bit at the back where there was like a little, there's like a panel, and I don't know which saint it was, but he took us into there, and it was a kind of classic saint, a white saint, with like little African naked people kind of bowing down in front of him. And I was like, oh, what's that? What's that about? He was like, oh, I don't think I've ever really looked at that, or looked at what the Latin inscription said, or whatever, or understood what that was. I think that once, like, I would have probably walked past that a few years ago, not even thought about it. So how can we all be more alert to those things and question them? I'm horrified that happened to you and that you were checked out the course for even questioning that. That is deeply disappointing and infuriating. How long ago was it? Was it, Bruce?
It was October 2019 and the blog was February last year. So I really wish I was telling you a story from the 80s, but I'm not. And I'm in a major city.
Okay, right.
And I did also report it to the Anti-Racism Task Force in the Church of England, because I know they can't deal with one-on-one cases, but I just wanted to say, I want you to know that this is what's happening where I am.
Gosh. And then, yeah, on the second pass around, well, it's kind of not even like genuine inclusivity, because inclusion still has this sense of some people doing the including, which I find a bit difficult. Like that's the fundamental problem, which is that it's not for white people to include Black people. It's not for straight people to include LGBT people. It's kind of, we all need to be equal. And so for me, it's around not just having, you should have Black people on the website. You should have, like, not just white people on the website. You should make sure that people at the front are not always white. But that's kind of the bare minimum. It also, like, we need to think about our theology, theologians that we're quoting. We need to understand who they are. We need to bring in voices from diverse theologies globally, not just British or European. It's really hard work to do this stuff. It's not easy. It takes a little bit more effort. So I think I've been in many multiracial churches that still really are white majority in terms of how you, as a person who's not white, is expected to act or be, or which Black people are included. I'm quite aware that I have certain privileges. I am middle class. I am Oxbridge educated, so I do have privilege that other people don't. And I'm I see myself as an almost acceptable face of Blackness, and so people feel like they might have ticked a box because I'm in certain spaces. But yeah, keen to hear what other thoughts people might have as well about those comments.
Just to kind of jump in, talking about the Church of England, that's an example, but it's not like racism isn't found in other churches and denominations. And so, yeah, just to kind of say it's broader than that. So even our conversation about institutional racism isn't just limited to the Church of England. Faith, go ahead.
So I do have some thoughts. I don't want to dominate, but I think when someone was asking about, like, what do we need to change to dig at the roots? One of the things I'm kind of getting at in my thesis that's a bit radical, but I think needs to be said, is I think there's a real problem with how white Western progressives view bodily rights. And so I think if we view, like, our rights of our bodies within a framework of having a right of autonomy or control over our body, we're essentially seeing ourselves as the landowner of the body. And so this is creating a divide between self and body. And so if you're a privileged white person like me, who comes from a family where land ownership is part of your history, you can't erase the history of how white colonialism is going to shape your thinking around that, around even the rights of over your own body, and even the thinking of it as rights over our bodies divides ourselves from our body, and in ways that, like, we just have to deal with the colonialism that's in that thinking. And also, if we think of having a right over our individual bodies, that kind of like puts a silo between us and others. And this is kind of, I think, getting back to, like, reading Kelly Brown Douglas's about the whiteness of cherished property. It's like, if I'm thinking as a white person of my body as my property, and I have rights to dispose of my property as I see fit, that's going to affect my relationality with others. But that's my thinking on it.
I was just kind of in responding to that a little bit is, you know, it probably goes without saying almost, but like for us, I think the difference, what's been really helpful to me in terms of the ideas of anti-racism versus just denying that you're racist and or calling someone racist, or is this idea that, like what you said, we can't divorce ourselves from the fact that we've been living and breathing in this environment of colonialism, and that it has shaped stuff that I'm not even aware of. So the only, it's not so much whether I'm racist or not, I don't want to be, but actively pursuing that kind of discipleship that leads me to be renewed and to see history as it truly is, to kind of own the things that have happened in the past. And I think, you know, it's like, I feel like I need to keep letting these stories wash over me, and, you know, in terms of repainting what actually happened, you know, and the book does that, along with some of the other ones that I've read in the last year or so. I feel like I need a new timeline. I need to recognize that the history that I've been taught is very slanted. I would love there to be like a shift in that in education. But for me now, as a nearly 50-year-old woman, I have some reframing of things to do. Sorry. Martina, did you have something that you wanted to say?
I don't know what to say. I'm just, thank you. I'm really glad that it resonated. And in many ways, you know, the book is written for Black women to give our voice to the world, a voice that hasn't been heard, particularly theologically or within the church. So I'm glad that it resonated. I guess I know that exact feeling of being disappointed. I think being disappointed with our family. I think that's probably what it is, where you realise that some things are more important to talk about or fight. There's lots that I didn't write in the book, and that's partly because my approach, my style of writing is about storytelling and connecting with people at a human level, even people I hope that would disagree with me. If they read some of the stories and from the personal perspective, I think it's harder to argue with someone's experience. I tried not to make it a here's all the things you white church did wrong. I just spoke from my perspective, but there are lots of things that I didn't write because I didn't, you know, I didn't want to upset people to the point where they wouldn't then move forward. But yeah, I experienced similar things, and that disappointment with our family. And I think the thing that I realized in that time was, again, that question of history. So growing up in the evangelical church, we would talk as if our form, the things that we were trying to preserve of our Christian faith were, you know, the authentic Christian faith. So, you know, the original. So we you know, all the, you know, past few decades of history have been wrong and we are right. Whereas I remembered when I worked for the Evangelical Alliance, one of my favourite, you know, stories about the Evangelical Alliance is when it started 175 years ago. British evangelicals decided not to let American evangelicals who owned slaves become members. So I was like, how on earth have we moved from that was 175 years ago to then to in certain spaces in the evangelical church questioning whether or not racism exists, or getting hung up on discussions around critical race theory as divisive. It's kind of, yeah, it's deeply disappointing. And yeah, I don't know what else to say about that.
David, did you have something to share?
Yeah, I'm going to try and weave a few a few thoughts together. Because interestingly, I belong to a white majority, American-based and headquartered evangelical church at the moment. And this weekend, we're having our UK church conference, right, virtually. And I'm choosing to be here because I thought this would be more helpful and therapeutic and spiritual for me rather than there. Because as the previous speaker said, I've experienced all of that and resigned from various things because I was the token Black person, right, in a lot of those spaces. But sort of going back to some of the previous comments as well, I'm also here because somebody said it earlier, that I have hope. And part of that hope is because of what's happened through COVID and on the back of George Floyd and a lot of those things, is one of the things that I see happening is the forming of new communities of equality, of empowerment, of sharing, and all of those things, Black, white, male, female, and the gamut, all right? So that gives me hope, but also as well, the writing and the research that's coming out now as well from different places and sources as well, that too is giving me hope. It's still difficult because you still have to get published, you still have to get peer reviewed and all of that stuff, but a lot of it's happening. So again, that's encouraging. And to my last comment will be that two of the things that have been helpful to me as a Black person, but also as a theologian and studying, I'm doing my master's in theology with Robert Beckford, as it happens as well, is reading people like Emmanuel Latte, right, who are writing back in the 80s and 90s and maybe before about some of the things that we're facing, about being truly multicultural. Okay, but also as well for my African brothers and sisters, reading some of Michael Battle's work about Ubuntu with Desmond Tutu, and that as well. And he says that is a gift to Western theology. So it's doing some of that reading and incorporating that into what we do and how we critique things using womanist theology as well. All of that is helpful and gives me hope. The battle will continue, you know, as critical race theory says, it's going to outlast us, but it doesn't mean we don't try.
Thank you, that's great. Chine, did you want to say anything?
No, I agree.
Oh, yeah. Brilliant. Phil, did you want to add to that? You're muted. You there, Phil?
Am I there?
There you go.
Can you turn off the recording?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. If you could not record.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
You meant the audio. Sorry.
Yeah. I'm not going to say anything that I didn't want to say, but I just.
Okay. So we've got about 15 minutes left, and I wondered if maybe we could together, if there's things that you feel like have come out of the conversations today or from the reading of the book that you feel like are actions. I mean, I don't, that sounds very task oriented, but I guess what I mean is, is there something that you're taking away from here that's going to be different? Whether that is, next step of reading more, having a conversation with someone, speaking out on something, and if you feel comfortable to, you can voice that, but also you can write it in the comments. And I think that would be, I don't know, it's important somehow to say this is something that's going to be a bit different in me or in my world. And if there's also any kind of final questions that you want to ask while we're doing that, that would be great. We're also, just to say, really up for suggestions of things that would be helpful to continue having these kinds of conversations within Red Letter Christians. So if there's something that stands out to you that way, feel free to send a message to me or mention it.
I just wanted to say thank you for introducing your work. And again, I apologize for not having read it yet. I think the more I'm hearing about it, the more I'm thinking it's probably going to find its way somewhere into my thesis here. I was particularly moved by when you were talking about beauty as the first racism and the way that Black female bodies are compared to white female bodies, and just tying some of this in with the work I'm doing around critiquing aspects of white feminism, I think is really helpful. So thank you.
I'd love to have Chine's book list. If there's a book list recommendations you have of things that you're reading now or that you recommend, maybe we can make that public.
Yeah, sure, I can suggest some now. I was just thinking I think we're so spoilt by amazing books, particularly from a Christian perspective, and on race as well over the past few years. But things I've been reading recently that I found really helpful include Womanist Midrash by Will Gaffney. There's a new book I've just got. It's called In My Grandmother's House. It's what's the writer's name? I can't remember what the writer's name is. But it's about Black women's faith. So it's a womanist perspective, but it's kind of through storytelling, similarly to mine. I guess on the kind of straight kind of thinking about race in Britain, David Ellis-Shover, Black and British, amazing book. Afua Hirsch's British, Akala's Natives, and Reni Eddo-Lodge's book, which I know that you read one of your last sessions as well. And then on two books that you've probably heard lots about if you're on social media, and I've read the past year that have been really helpful, particularly in thinking about whiteness, white supremacy and patriarchy. The Making of Biblical Womanhood by Beth Allison Barr, and Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes-Dume, who those are absolutely brilliant books, and they so Jesus and John Wayne charts basically the past few decades of evangelicalism and why it was no surprise that they ended up with Trump. And The Making of Biblical Womanhood is basically it casts light on basically biblical translation and how problematic it has been in I guess the place of women in the church. And those are really good. There's loads more as well.
Yeah. Those last two that you mentioned, Jesus and John Wayne and The Making of Biblical Womanhood, the US Red Letter Christians have a book club too, and they've done sessions with both of those authors, with Shane, and I think they're recorded. So if I can track them down, I'll share them on our page with some links. I would love to, part of me is like, oh, it'd be really interesting to think about how we can have some transatlantic conversations around justice and race and all sorts of different subjects, because it's that, kind of jumping into where the differences are, where culturally there's overlap and where there isn't, I think is, in terms of like retelling our historical narrative too, I think is really useful, and our theological narrative.
So I did a couple of transatlantic conversations up in the weeks after George Floyd's death, but one that was really good was the Greenbelt one we did, that I chaired, and we had two Black British theologians, two Black Americans. So we had Jamar Tisby, who wrote The Colour of Compromise, and Dante Stewart, whose new book is coming out soon. I can't remember what it's called. And then on the British side, we had Anthony Reddy and Selena Stone. But that was a really, really interesting conversation in thinking about the similarities and the differences. But the pain that we were all in those weeks last year.
We can share a link to that too. I think I'll do like a follow-up message when we make this video available, and put a bunch of resources in that were mentioned today. So I'm just wondering, I want to give this last 10 minutes if there's anything anyone else would like to say or share, or just thanks. Floor is open. Oh, Siobhan, you're muted.
Oh. You think after a year you'd get this sorted. Would you mind turning the recording off for now, if that's okay? Thank you.
Just restarted the recording. So.
I would say though that I am coming to preach at St Andrews in October at the Evensong. No, it's not Evensong. It's a Sunday at the chapel. So that will be a black woman, I guess, in that space. But yeah, others don't want to jump.
So can I throw in a comment? Maybe this is my upcoming book. Universities and churches are the most racist places on the planet, but they're also the places of greatest activism. So, you know, it's just interesting to me. So yeah, St Andrews with the legacy of the Torrances and all of that. So it is quite interesting. I've done works in universities and it's impossible to get them to move, but we keep trying.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I see that. Sorry. I was just going to say, this is my other role as a church leader. I lead an inclusive church, and it's definitely white majority. And I think one of some bits of good advice that I've been given as I've had like folks, people of color, trans people kind of journeying along with me is, you know, where we don't have people within our congregation, we're really conscious of inviting folks in to speak to us and being in that kind of position of learning. So that's one thing that's been really helpful for us, is kind of just seeking out friends and seeking out folks who are willing to, like, you know, speak into what's going on with us, and to put them up front and just learn together. So that's one practical thing that we've tried to do, is just bring in speakers that have kind of filled where we maybe don't have as much representation.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And thank you, David. I can agree with you on that front. And Chine, I'm very excited that you'll be coming to St Andrews. So I don't know where we can find out exact information, but if that's the case, then I can kind of share that with people that I know. I'm actually in Surrey, England at the moment, so I might not be able to go back there. But thank you. That's so exciting to hear.
I think it's October 30th, and it will be on the chapel thingy website.
Great. Any final comments before I'd like to just pray for us before we finish? Faith, one last.
I really was moved, Chine, when you were talking about global theologians. One of the things I'm doing in my work is bringing in global Pentecostal voices and into conversation with feminist theology. And I think one of the things, if we look at the direction of the church, is getting rid of this idea that Pentecostal equals fundamentalist, and therefore we can't engage with its theology. And so that's just something I'm working on.
Okay, thank you. And just to say, if anyone has spoken on camera and then they're like, oh, actually, I don't want that to be part of any video that's released, you can let me know either now or, you know, later today or tomorrow, whatever, and I will edit anything out that you're not comfortable with being public. So just to say, I'm just gonna finish by saying a huge thank you, Chine, to you for being with us today and for like laying out so much of your heart and soul for us in the book and in person. And it's been a really powerful experience personally for me, and I feel like it's going to keep teaching me. And I'd love to have more conversations with you and maybe a coffee sometime. So I think just we're really, really grateful. Let me pray for us and for you, just to kind of finish this time off. God of the universe, we want to thank you for this space of openness and vulnerability and learning together. And I thank you for these folks who've been willing to be open about themselves and to share personal details and to share where we're journeying and where we're struggling. I thank you especially for Chine, who's been so open with her time and with her emotional energy and her words and her vulnerability. And thank you for the modeling of that to us. And I pray that the things that we've heard in this space and that we're wrestling with, that the Spirit will continue to do your work in our hearts and in our minds, and where change is needed, whether that's on a personal level or speaking or acting for justice locally in our communities and our families, that you would move us to do that, and that you'd give us the spiritual resources to do what's needed to see justice come. We pray for your kingdom to be here present with us now in this world, and we pray for your kingdom to come. We pray your blessing on Chine, and we pray for your Spirit to continue to move in her, to give her the strength that she needs to speak, to give her allies and people around her who have her back continually. I pray for the resilience when there's people that are critical or say things that are hurtful or painful, that you would fill her with words of hope, with words of joy, and that she'd be really aware of your pleasure and your joy in her as she is. Thank you, Lord, for this time again together. Amen. Thank you again, everybody. Chine, did you have anything you wanted to just say before I cut you off?
No, just thank you so much. Thank you for engaging. Yeah, I find being in these spaces are really helpful and just expanding my own mind and thinking and going off to read new things as well. And it really kind of helps enrichen my thoughts on this stuff.
Oh, there's a question about when the next book club session is. So we're aiming to do them every 6 weeks, a couple of months. There's the next book club is start of October, and it's being interrupted with Al Barrett and Ruth Harley, and they'll be joining us. And so that'll be a really interesting discussion, and that's again, great missional, really rooted in reality book in local Birmingham thing. And then in the start of November, there is Jarrell Robinson Brown coming to speak about his new book, and that's called Black, Gay, British, Christian, Queer, or something in that order. So that should be a really fascinating time together. So great. And when this video is up, I will send everyone a little email. But thank you so much for engaging today. I really appreciate your time and your energy. So we will see you soon. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.